Okay. Okay, so the topic that I'm going to discuss is the basic and the initial approach to a suspected lung malignancy. So the overview of this presentation is, first I'm going to describe a few things about how exactly we would come to a diagnosis of a lung malignancy, both in the settings of a symptomatic presentation to the clinic and also in the setting of an incidental pulmonary nodule diagnosed on a CT or a chest X-ray done for some other reason. And then we would proceed on with the initial evaluation, the diagnosis and the staging of lung malignancies. Most of the talk is going to be focused on non-small cell lung cancer with a few additional points on small cell lung cancer. Small cell will be dealt with separately in a different topic. So lung cancer, as you all know, is a leading cause of cancer-related death in both the genders, both worldwide and country specific. Especially if you look at the trend of lung cancer in the US, it is only next to prostate cancer in males and next to breast cancer in females, but it is the leading cause of death of cancer related mortality. The same in European countries as well. But the striking difference between the West and Asian countries is, since the 1990s and 2000s, the incidence and the death rate of lung cancers has been coming down in USA and in European countries, partly because of the awareness that this is a smoking related disease. Whereas in Asian countries like China and India, it has been going up. And this is the scenario worldwide. So there are 12 people diagnosed every 3 minutes as per the GlobeCan data, and around 10 of them die every 3 minutes. So that is the burden of lung cancer in the world. So how do lung cancer patients present? So most of these patients, usually in countries like India and China, where there is no program for lung cancer screening, they present with symptoms that could be related to chest disease. And then further evaluation with clinical examination, radiological examination would guide to a probable diagnosis of lung malignancy. Or in countries which have a screening protocol in place, many of them are also detected as an incidental finding on chest radiograph. We're going to deal with both these scenarios. So the most common symptoms that we present that patients present to are cough, hemoptysis, and to a lesser extent dyspnea and chest pain. And when these symptoms are present, usually most of these are in advanced stage disease. Any of these symptoms could also be accompanied by symptoms of advanced disease like hoarseness, pleural effusion, pleural involvement, or symptoms related to Pancoast tumors that are Horner syndrome, where there's ptosis, meiosis, atrophy of the hand muscles, and there's constant pain in the arm, or SVC syndrome. These are all indicators of very advanced disease in lung cancer. And there could be other manifestations also which a clinician should look forward for, especially in terms of distant metastasis, where there could be bone pain or symptoms related to brain metastasis, or in rare situations, paraneoplastic syndromes like hypercalcemia, syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone secretion, and many neurological manifestations. So this is a picture of a SVC syndrome caused by a superior cercus tumor, and this is malignant pleural effusion. So basically, the symptoms related to this are not very specific for any particular histology of lung cancer. They could all be overlapping. However, there are some clinical points that have to be kept in mind, such that small cell lung cancers usually are more rapid in progression, and they present with metastasis early on as opposed to non-small cell lung cancers. And also Pancoast tumors or superior cercus tumors have hypercalcemia, etc., more common. So that was patients that would present to you with symptoms like cough, and you would try and evaluate them with a chest X-ray or a CT chest. The other side of the coin is where patients come to you with an imaging that was done as part of a routine health checkup or an annual CT thorax, which is now becoming more common in the West. In these cases, you could detect a lung mass either in the chest X-ray or in the chest CT, which would lead you to do further investigations and basically try and figure out what the risk of malignancy could be in these cases. So if there's an incidental lung mass that is detected on a chest X-ray, so what are the features that would warrant or that should be dealt with in an emergent basis with a CT thorax? So this is a new lesion that has come up with the chest radiograph. If you compare it to a previous chest radiograph or a pleural effusion or any sort of lung collapse without any reason, or it could be, for that matter, they could be pleural effusion or post-obstructive pneumonia as well. So in these cases, when you do a CT thorax, you are trying to do a contrast CT or a plain CT, depending on what the indication is. Most commonly, you would start off with a non-contrast CT, and if that does not give you any further diagnosis, you would also proceed with a contrast CT. So what could be the possibilities when you have a chest radiograph or a CT thorax? So basically, you could, based on the size of the mass, you could categorize them as a lung mass, which is more than 3 centimeters, which could have suspicious characteristics, or it could be a lesion that is less than 3 centimeters, which by definition is a solitary pulmonary nodule. So a lung mass that is greater than 3 centimeters with suspicious features like a speculated border and a patient with a smoking history and no other underlying lung disease would be a highly suspicious lesion for a lung malignancy. Whereas a solitary pulmonary nodule, which is less than 3 centimeters, you have several different characteristics and there are several different models for you to try and determine the risk of these patients. We'll try and come to all of these together. So basically, as I said, a nodule is something that is less than 3 centimeters that is detected on a cross-sectional imaging for an unrelated region. And what you should think of is a nodule is by itself not going to be malignant or benign. You need to keep the clinical history and the findings, radiological findings in picture along with other characteristics, try and determine what the probability of malignancy is. So morphologically, what could the radiologist try and tell you? So they could tell you that a nodule is completely solid or it is subsolid. And again, subsolid lesions are divided into pure ground glass lesions or part solid lesions. Why this becomes important is the risk of malignancy that is associated with each of these in different models that are available freely to use is kind of different for each of these. Solid nodules are more likely to be malignant as opposed to pure ground glass nodularity. And also the size plays a picture. Any nodule that is more than 8 millimeters is usually suggestive of a malignant lesion. Something which is less than 8 millimeters could be followed up. So there are strict guidelines for each of this. Though in the past, most of these were determined by the radiologist or the clinician as to whether follow these lesions or try and evaluate with a biopsy. Today, there are guidelines which we'll just discuss about that. So an incidental pulmonary nodule, as you see, this is less than 3 centimeters detected when on a CT chest. So the differential diagnosis of an incidental pulmonary nodules broadly are going to be malignant and benign. So what a CT scan should try and report is how large the lesion is, the largest dimension, whether it is less than 3 centimeters or more than 3 centimeters, and to the exact millimeters, how the borders are, whether they are irregular, speculated, or smooth borders. Also, the location is important because upper lobe lesions are more likely to be malignant, and the presence of any subsolid components in these lesions. So after getting all that information, the patients are categorized into 3 different groups. They are which have low probability of lung malignancy, intermediate probability, and high probability. And this is based on scientific models, based on studies on many thousands of patients, and the most famous of that is the Brooks model. So this is a picture of the Brooks model that is available online. There are other models also, like the Mayo Clinic model and the Veterans Administration model. Basically, what they try and ask you to punch in is the age of the patient, basic demographic data like sex, if they have any previous history of smoking. Apart from that, the characteristics of the nodule, like the size of the nodule in millimeters, the location of the nodule, and whether the nodule is solid, subsolid, or partially solid. So in this case, when you enter this data, you get a risk of malignancy. And that is how, so clinically determining if the risk of malignancy is around more than 40 or something like that, you would try and investigate this patient further to do a biopsy. If not, you would try and leave them alone. So again, what kind of investigation would you get on a solitary pulmonary nodule? By definition, this was probably detected by a chest radiograph or a CT, this thing. But once you get a CT, you could also do a PET CT to try and assess some particular sorts of nodules. For example, a good example of this is if on CT there is a 10 millimeter nodule that you cannot determine whether it's malignant or benign. Getting an additional investigation with a PET CT, especially if it is a solid nodule, can help in characterizing these lesions. So if there's no FDG avidity and the size is more than 8 millimeters, it's probably benign. So this is just a broad overview as to what our thought process should be in these cases. So when you get a nodule that is seen on a chest radiograph, either the radiologist can tell you that straight away that is benign. How would that be? They would compare it to previous chest radiographs. So if there's no increase in size for 2 years and there is calcification, then they could probably with good certainty tell you that it is benign. In such cases, no further investigation. Or it could be an indeterminate lesion. In such case, you would try and investigate further with a PET CT or a CT scan. Again, after CT, you add on more information. The radiologist would tell you if it is benign or a particular condition which can be treated, like an AV malformation or a calcification that has to be left alone. Or if it's still indeterminate, the next step would be to go and do a biopsy. So this is the broad thing. So broadly, if you want run-of-the-mill way of dividing this, there are leave-alone lesions like old calcified granulomas, or there are lesions where you would right away know what kind of management you want to do, like a AV malformation where you have to do a coiling. And most lesions would fall in the indeterminate category. And there are two ways in which indeterminate category lesions have to be dealt with. One, if they fall into those criteria where you can follow up these patients safely, and we will come to that criteria, you follow them up with a repeat imaging after 6 months, or else you do a biopsy on these patients. So that is based on guidelines. So these are the Flexner Society guidelines of 2017. They were modified from the initial guidelines from 2004, in which the take-home points is that any solitary pulmonary nodule less than 6 millimeters, you don't need to do anything. There's no follow-up needed for them. Anything that is greater than 8 millimeter, either you biopsy or you do a repeat imaging at short duration. So that is what it means. So why so much talk on solitary pulmonary nodules? Because this is an increasing problem in the West, because most of them have a screening program of annual low dose computed tomography screening. It is not there in Asian countries yet. However, because of increasing CT screening, solitary pulmonary nodules are detected with more incidence. So what have we discussed till now? The basic lung cancer burden in the world, and how are these suspected? One is symptomatic presentation, another is incidental imaging. What do you do further? You risk stratify these patients. If it is a mass with symptoms, definitely you try and see if it fits into lung malignancy, you go ahead and do a biopsy. Else, if it is asymptomatic solitary pulmonary nodule, which is small, you try and determine the risk. Then based on the guidelines, you either biopsy them, follow them up, or try and leave them alone. So once you biopsy, you get a confirmed lung malignancy. So next question is, how do you biopsy? You see a lung mass on a CT scan.
Varun?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, there is a segment of these patients where you don't need to biopsy and directly take for surgery, isn't it?
Correct.
So where is that? You're covering that?
Yeah, it is there in the slide, the
Okay.
later slides. Anyway, I'll this thing, because if the lesion is quite small and if the radiologist can tell you that it is, if it is a peripheral lesion, surgery, VAT surgery is not going to add in too much morbidity. You can straight away go and do a resection in these patients. You don't have to biopsy. For example, a 1 centimeter lesion.
No, there are some more criteria, no, radiological criteria which are characteristic, like solid tumor, solid lesion, of size. I think for solid it's more than 8 millimeters, and if it is, there are some criteria which are there actually. It is mentioned some. I remember it,
It
but
is
I
not
don't
there
know
in
the
the
exact.
guidelines, but these are all things that are mentioned in this thing in case discussions, where it has to be an MDT. There is also a school of thought where
Yeah.
you don't have to do a biopsy if
Yeah.
the radiological risk of malignancy is more than 80%. But however, in all the
Okay.
Asian guidelines, they say that you have to do a biopsy. That is partly because the risk of you having tuberculosis or any other granulomatous disease is very high. So in Asian guidelines throughout they say, but in Western guidelines, definitely both in radiological and surgical guidelines, if it is more than 70 or 80%, they can even go ahead with surgery without biopsy. That is
okay. Yeah.
So this is basically a slide on what technique of biopsy would you try and use. So that basically depends on trying to figure out what is the easiest route possible to get a good
Hi,
biopsy.
Varun. Is there a Asian guideline for the solid
Actually, there is a
pulmonary?
modification. There is a modification of the ESMO guidelines itself for Asia, 2017, sir.
Mm-hmm. So ESMO
There
Asia,
is a
you mean?
yeah, there is a modification of the ESMO guidelines. It's there online.
Okay.
This thing. And it's mostly Chinese. Yeah. Not sure. So the basic principle is you try and get the easiest route possible for the chosen location, and also if you could try and get both the staging of the tumor and the diagnosis at the same time, that should be the ideal route. Like for example, if you have a large node and you know that you can biopsy it, both get tissue for diagnosis and upstage the tumor, you should go ahead for it. So based on the location of the tumor, you could, if it is a centrally located tumor, you would prefer a bronchoscopy. That could be a conventional bronchoscopic biopsy, or it could be a EBUS guided, which is endobronchial ultrasound guided biopsy. Or if it is a peripheral lesions, you could do a CT guided thoracic needle biopsy. And in those conditions where there is a peripheral lesion that is very small, not amenable for biopsy, and the risk of malignancy is quite high, and upfront surgery is not going to be that much of a problem, you could as well do a VATS in the same setting. You would get a biopsy, and that would be the management also in that case. So once you have confirmed a lung malignancy, what would be the initial investigations that you would do? You would obviously assess, do a good history and examination of the patient, and assess for any other comorbidities and the performance status. Do a thorough cardiovascular and respiratory evaluation as well. In terms of staging, what all the guidelines say is CT scan of the thorax up to the upper abdomen to also include the adrenals is a staging that is the baseline for all lung malignancies. In addition to that, adding a PET CT would try and have an incremental value of at least 10 to 20% in upstaging patients. So PET CT in some guidelines is not mandatory, but in most institutions, because of the convenience, PET CT is followed. And definitely in very early stage tumors like T1N0, you could as well avoid a PET CT. So CT scan of the chest up to the upper abdomen is mandatory. PET CT, again, if your institution has the facility, it's better to go. It upstages many patients, and you could avoid futile thoracotomies. MRI brain, again, very early tumors like T1N0, you can avoid an MRI brain, but otherwise all symptomatic patients and stage 2 to stage 4, you need to get an MRI brain. Bone scan was done earlier when there was no PET CT, as if you had symptoms of bone pain along with CT scan, you would do a bone scan. But now the most common thing that is done is a PET CT along with a brain MRI. That is for staging evaluation of a lung malignancy. So after you get the histopathology, this thing, your pathologist would try and categorize this into either a small cell lung cancer or a non-small cell lung cancer, which again, there are 4 different kinds of histologies in non-small cell lung cancers. All these 4 put together are still dealt with as one entity as non-small cell lung cancer, and the management does not change. IHCs have started playing a major role in diagnosing and characterizing these, because in microscopy, you could try and, most cases, you could try and differentiate if it is a small cell or a non-small cell. But to try and differentiate into adenocarcinoma of lung origin, you would try and do some IHCs. In this case, for adenocarcinoma of the lung, you would do a TTF1 positive and a CK7 positive. That would be positive for lung. And if it is a squamous histology, it's CK5 and 6 positive and P40 positive. So after you've got the diagnosis of lung cancer and done a thorough staging investigation, you try and stage this patient as per the TNM. You have the latest AJCC 8th staging, but I just wanted to go through the 7th because most of us are used to the 7th, and so that I can put in what changes are there to the 8th. This thing. So basically, what the AJCC 7th did was determine the tumor size and the nodal disease, and then additional features related to the T categorization for staging. For example, if you see here T1A, T1B, T2A, T2B, these are all increasing sizes of the primary tumor. After you have assessed the tumor size, the next thing that you would try and see if there is any local invasion and try and upstage these tumors. So this was a good diagram to illustrate that point. For example, if there is superior sulcus involvement, it's T3, or if there is involvement of any other major structures, it's T4, and pleural involvement would be T2. So that way, once the tumor size has been assessed, then you try and see if there's any other involvement related to local invasion. Then the next thing you would try and see is if there's any other nodule apart from the main tumor that you're trying to look at. If there are multiple nodules,
Ajay,
for
can you
example, in
make it
this,
full screen, Ajay?
you want me to?
Can you make it full screen?
It is full screen. You want me to zoom it? Is
No,
it?
we are able to see. We are seeing the presentation, presenter's view.
Oh, you're seeing the presenter's view. I'm so sorry.
Try swap display upstairs to the right.
Just hold on 1 second. I didn't realize that. Now can you see the full screen?
Yeah, now it's full screen.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I had 2 screens actually. So I was sharing the wrong screen. Yeah, and the next thing that you would do after that is try and determine if there's any endobronchial invasion, based on which again the T stage could change. So this is the gist of that. And again, nodal staging, basically it's divided into N1, N2, and N3. N1 are hilar lymph nodes, which are pertinent to the side of the lung that you're trying and evaluating. N2 are mediastinal lymph nodes. I'll try and show a diagram of the lymph node stations as well. And N3 are contralateral hilar, contralateral mediastinal, and scalene and supraclavicular lymph nodes. So this is the diagram basically illustrating the lymph nodes. So whatever you see in single digits, 2 to 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 up to 9 are mediastinal lymph nodes. So paratracheal lymph nodes would be 2R, that is right, 2L is left, then 4R and 4L. Then you have 7, which is subcarinal, and you have the rest of the ones subaortic and paraortic. And these N1 nodes are the hilar lymph nodes and the lobar and subsegmental lymph nodes. And N3 are supraclavicular and scalene lymph nodes. So what has changed between 7th and AJCC 8th is basically the fact that each centimeter counts till 5 centimeters. For in the previous TNM staging, 3 to 5 was categorized as 2A. Now here what is being done is each centimeter has been given its own stage, T1A, T1B, T1C, T2A, T2B, up to 5 centimeters. That is one change that has occurred. There has been some downstaging happening for lesions that involve the main bronchus, which was initially T3 and now is T2, and upstaging of invasion into the diaphragm to T4. These are the main changes that have occurred. Also, there are additional stage categories that have been added into these AJCC 8. We'll come to that. And for the first time, they have also included the rules for measurement of tumor size in nodules which are part solid and solid tumors. What is mentioned in the AJCC 8 is in tumors that are part solid, the radiological assessment should be determined by the by the central portion of the tumor, and also the histological assessment should be in the invasive component, because a subsolid could have an invasive and a minimally invasive component. How you determine the dimension of the tumor is only based on the invasive component. So that is the change that is there. So in the stage grouping, stage 1 has been divided to accommodate for each of the centimeters that have been added. And basically N1 and N2, N3 is 2B, 3A and 3B, except for advanced T3 and T4, where you have an upstaging. And 3C is the new stage that has been added here. So to get a gist of what I was trying to say, so these two diagrams are probably the core of what I wanted to say. This would give a reasonably good clinical staging after a radiological investigation is done on these patients, like a PET-CT or a CT scan. The T size of the tumor can be determined. Invasion to local structures like pericardium or pleura or diaphragm could be determined. So the T stage could be adequately determined. The N stage could be determined by the appearance of any node that is more than 1 centimeter, either on CT scan or any node that takes up FDG uptake, either in the hilar region, mediastinal nodes, or in the N3 stations. So based on this, you get a radiological staging. What you do next with that is basically you would try and do an invasive staging of the mediastinum, and there are a couple of reasons for this. The T stage is usually appropriate with the radiological investigation, but what happens with the nodal staging is most of the times, even with a PET positive or a CT positive node, there could be false positives, and there are many instances where nodes may not be picked up by CT scan. So the positive predictive and the negative predictive value of a standalone CT or a PET CT is not very accurate. So you need to complement it with an invasive mediastinal staging as per the guidelines of the European Society. So that's why I'll try and discuss a little bit on mediastinal staging with regards to clinical staging here. So the guidelines for this have been, there are two papers, one from the US and one from Europe, and they have pretty much incorporated most of the evidence that is there on trying and doing a mediastinal staging, appropriate mediastinal staging. These are the two papers. And what they essentially try and tell you is that you try and divide most of the clinical scenarios that you see with respect to nodes into 3 different categories. One is you see large lymph nodes either on the CT scan or on the PET scan, quite large lymph nodes that you see. Second thing, you don't see any lymph nodes or any uptake in the mediastinal region on a PET scan. The third thing is you get a pretty good suspicion that there could be a mediastinal lymph node, but actually you cannot see a node. So these are the broad categories. I'll try and put in this thing. So if you see this flow chart, and the following flow chart is just a representation of this. So what you try and divide after you do a CT scan and a PET scan is either you see some sort of lymph node in the mediastinum, which is more than 1 centimeter on CT scan, or any FDG uptake in the lymph node could be considered as positive, or you do not see. What happens when you see a lymph node is your positive predictive value for this lymph node is still not very accurate with a single investigation. So you will have to confirm this with an endobronchial ultrasound, which is probably the easiest because you already have seen the node, you know which station to sample. So in that, if you try and get a positive lymph node, then you go ahead with treating the patient. If you get a negative lymph node, you still have to do a video assisted mediastinoscopic examination and then prove that is negative and then go for surgery. So why is this so complicated and why can't it just be done with a single investigation? The reason, again, as I said, the negative predictive value of a single investigation or a positive predictive value of a single investigation, radiological investigation for lymph nodes in lung is not very accurate. That is the single sole reason why this has to be done and why this multiple investigations have been added to truly try and determine that there are no mediastinal lymph nodes before you try and do surgery in these patients. But at the end of it, the discussion comes, why would you want to do surgery? Why would you not want to do surgery in in a mediastinal positive patient? So there are trials regarding that, which I would come to. So is there any clarification on this? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Ajay.
Yeah. So
Proceed.
yeah. So if there are lymph nodes in the mediastinum, and when I say mediastinal lymph nodes, it's N2 and above. It is not N1. So N1 lymph nodes are not the mediastinal lymph nodes. They are hilar lymph nodes. So N2 and above, N2 and N3. So if you see any PET positive or CT positive lymph node, you try and do an EBUS. If it comes as negative, then you again go and do a video assisted mediastinoscopy. And again, if it is negative, then you truly say that this patient is node negative, and then you can go for surgery. If anywhere in this process you can determine that there is a positive node, the patient will go for a multidisciplinary treatment. That is when you see a node on a PET CT or a CT scan. What if you do not see any node on a PET CT or CT scan? You still cannot say that this patient is truly negative. Then you have two options. There are patients which are very low risk for actually mediastinal lymph node metastasis. That is peripheral tumors that are less than 3 centimeters, and you cannot find a lymph node on the CT scan. In such cases, and that is the sole exception where you can go for surgery without any other EBUS or VAM investigations. In the other scenario where you get a suspicion of occult lymph node metastasis, for example, if there is a central tumor, or if there's a tumor which has a high FDG uptake, or a tumor greater than 3 centimeters, even though the CT or PET does not pick up a lymph node, you have to do an EBUS, or a VAM, and then try and prove whether it's positive or negative, and then go for surgery. So these are the European Society guidelines, and these guidelines have been validated at least twice. So, and as you can see, the negative predictive value is very high with this approach, where you add on different steps where you try and prove whether it is positive or negative. So if you want to avoid operating on an N2 disease, you need to follow these guidelines. So what do you do when you have an N2 disease when you operate on a patient? So that is when you call the patient as an unsuspected N2. So that is, you have done the proper guide as per the guidelines. You have staged the patient with the PET CT, with the EBUS and a VAM, and still you got an N2 disease on surgery. So that is an unsuspected N2 disease, and that is acceptable. What is usually not acceptable is when you have a suspicion for nodal disease and you do not progress to try and adequately stage the mediastinum. And why is that so? Because if you have an unsuspected N2, most of the times that N2 is usually going to be single station. You could probably get an R0 resection on them, and the prognosis is quite good. But if you do not stage the mediastinum adequately, you go ahead and do surgery primarily in an N2 disease. The 5-year survival results of these patients are less than 20%. That is actually quite even less than what CTRT could achieve. And that is detrimental to the patient. And that's the logic behind why to aggressively try and stage the mediastinum. So a small note regarding left lung tumors. So this was the category that was there on to the far left. Imaging wise, mediastinum negative, low risk tumors, peripheral tumors less than 3 centimeters. What if they were left-sided tumors? This would what would happen. So left-sided tumors, the mediastinal nodes which are there are behind these vascular structures. So behind the aorta and AP window. And if you do not do a proper mediastinoscopy and try and target these nodes, most of the time during surgery, it is quite difficult to address these nodes in a left-sided tumors as opposed to a right-sided tumors. So this is just putting all that I've said into one slide. So what you could see on a CT scan is these three categories for lymph nodes: no lymph nodes, very large lymph nodes, or somewhere in between. So if you have very large lymph nodes with extensive mediastinal infiltration, again, in those cases, there is no point in trying and doing an EBUS or a MEAD, because in most probability, they're going to be positive. In that cases, you try and determine them. If they are unresectable N2, they go ahead for multimodality management. In the other scenario where you have no enlarged lymph nodes and it is a low risk primary tumor that is less than 3 centimeters in the periphery, you again don't have to do any kind of invasive investigation because the risk of mediastinal N2 is quite low. In such cases, again, you can go ahead for surgery. And in case you get an N2 unforeseen, you give them adjuvant chemotherapy. The intermediate category, where you have hilar lymph nodes or you have a large tumor, you have a single station N2, you don't know if it is positive, you have to try and do an invasive mediastinal staging in the form of an EBUS followed by a VAM. And in that case, determine if it is positive or negative. Yeah. So what we have covered in mediastinal staging is what we would try and do before surgery. Intraoperatively, you need to do a systematic lymph node dissection in all patients that undergo radical resection. And this was kind of defined in 1996 itself, where the most ideal would be to try and remove all the mediastinal fat, including all the lymph nodes. But if you cannot achieve that, the alternate approach is to try and at least target 3 nodal stations, one of which should always be a subcarinal lymph nodal station. And this was again modified later to include lobe specific lymph nodes that have to be addressed during surgery. So all of these, any lobe, either right or left, all of them, you have to address the subcarinal, and depending on the kind of lobe, you have to address those other 2 specific nodes. These are for mediastinal N2 nodes. Anyway, N1 nodes, you will try and address them during primary surgery. So should you have to do a complete lymph node dissection in all patients versus try and do a sampling? Well, there are studies for that, and there is a very particular small group where you could try and do sampling, which is T1, T2, N0 patients, where you can do lobe specific sampling of the lymph nodes. Most of the other patients, it's better to go ahead and do a systematic lymph node dissection during surgery. So what happens if SMLND is not performed? So as you can see the survival graphs, there is a significant difference between the survival graphs in patients who did not receive systematic nodal dissection during surgery.
Varun, there are no RCTs for systematic lymph node dissections.
This is not an RCT, sir.
Yeah, because as of now, the evidence is not so strong either ways. Unfortunately, what has happened is whatever trials we are seeing now, all those trials, the nodal yield between systematic lymph node dissection and the sampling is almost equivalent. That is another issue which we notice. You see any trial, they all are like that. So actually, nobody knows whether it is needed or not needed. But as a practice, most of us
are doing, and most of the data is actually retrospective meta-analysis. Whatever is there.
Yeah.
So clinical staging, if you follow the guidelines, you would be on safe grounds because you would not try and miss an N2 disease. And intraoperatively, systematic lymph node dissection should be followed, except in few situations. So after you have diagnosed the lung malignancy, staged it with PET CT, MRI brain, and this thing, mediastinal staging, you would try and determine what kind of management this patient would try and do. If you determine this patient needs surgical therapy, you would try and do a functional evaluation on this patient, which is try and do a lung function test, a spirometry, and FEV1 and DLCO values are determined. So this is an algorithm to try and see what your anatomical resection section would be for the lung, would try and be extrapolated to what would be the functional reserve of the patient at the end of resection. And in most of the cases, if both FEV1 and DLCO is more than 80, patient would tolerate a surgery up to pneumonectomy. But anything less than that, you would have to do a split function evaluation and try and see if a lobar resection would be feasible in these patients or no. We also do a cardiac evaluation for these patients before taking up for surgery. So the management for small cell lung cancer, this is going to be an overview of what has to be done in each stage rather than the specific details. So the basic way to think about this is to try and divide them into early stage, locally advanced stage, and metastatic non-small cell lung cancer. So regarding early stage, the primary modality of treatment is surgical therapy if the patient can tolerate it. Because if the patient cannot tolerate it, either because of functional reasons or other reasons, the other viable option is to do definitive radiation, SBRT, in these patients. So I'm going to primarily talk about surgical management. So the surgery is going to be a complete radical resection of the primary tumor along with a lymph node dissection. And what kind of resection we would do? The standard is lobectomy, but there are special scenarios where sublobar resection is also acceptable. A lobectomy, bilobectomy, and pneumonectomy are usually the standards based on what the tumor requires. So again, as I said, most centers try and do a lobectomy, but there are specific scenarios where if it is a T1N0 tumor presenting with ground glass opacities, or if it's a purely adenocarcinoma in situ less than 2 centimeters, you could do a sublobar resection as well without doing a lymph node dissection in these patients. And the survival rates are equivalent. These are some of the newer things that are coming up. VATS is video assisted thoracoscopic surgery, and RATS is robotic thoracoscopic surgery. Both of them have the advantage of faster recovery and better patient outcomes. And you have parenchymal preserving surgeries as well, where in central tumors, where you would try and do a resection of the lobe.
Varun, you're talking about MIS as though it is coming up. We do mostly MIS only, man.
Correct. Yeah, we do.
Yeah, we hardly ever do open.
Correct. No, I said new thing as in for the trials, it is a new thing. But
yeah, but there is evidence also now. There is
correct. That is the graph that I have shown. This is actually showing that minimally invasive is equally good, or in fact, in the short term, it is actually superior in patient outcomes. In the long term, it's almost the same. Parenchymal preserving surgeries is something which is not done in most centers because it's technically quite demanding, in which you don't want, in which centrally located tumors, which in conventional sense would have required a pneumonectomy. What you try and do is you try and do a bronchial resection, and then the lobe that is attached to the distal bronchus, you come and attach it to the carina again. It is like a segmental resection along with the involved parenchyma, along with that bronchus, not removing the full distal bronchus, preserving it, and then coming and joining. That is kind of represented in this picture. So because it involves bronchial anastomosis, the risk of leaks are quite high. Most centers usually don't follow it. It's quite common in Eastern countries. They are doing it often.
This is same as sleeve resection, no?
Yeah, sleeve resections. Basic premise is to preserve the parenchyma.
See,
So-
in selected tumors, neuroendocrine tumors and all, we can also do this. But many of our patients are not suitable for this. That is the issue, because say a small neuroendocrine tumor sitting over there, it's possible to do. If you get such tumors, it's possible to do.
Correct.
We
We
can
all get
technically.
in carcinoids, yes,
Okay.
it can be done. It's this thing
Yeah.
because they're usually confined to the bronchus itself. We usually get more advanced tumors, I think. So
We
after
have
the
done
surgery,
bronchotomies and carcinoids we have done. No, last case which we did, that case also we did a bronchotomy to see what was the margin. Otherwise, we had planned for pneumonectomy as well. That lady we did.
bronchial anastomosis we did, huh?
No, we didn't do anastomosis, but it was extending into the main bronchus, the tumor. So it was basically a polypoidal carcinoid which was extending into the main bronchus. So we did a bronchotomy, we assessed the margin and then closed the bronchotomy.
It was arising from upper lobe and was protruding into the intermediate bronchus. So we did a right upper lobe bronchotomy and checked the margin and sutured the intermediate bronchus.
Okay, we suture. This is complete resection and then end to end.
It was not like this.
Yeah, so that if it is probably extending into the intermediate bronchus, in these cases we would try and do an end-to-end anastomosis. But in this case, I think it was just a bronchotomy was enough.
Finding such cases in institutes like India might be difficult. If we're in a completely referral center where we are doing a lot of thoracic work, there maybe we might get such cases.
Yeah. So early stage after surgery, there is definitely a role for adjuvant chemotherapy. The slides are there later on. So most centers follow the rule of any tumor more than 4 centimeters or any node positive. That's based on a previous trial that was done. They give platinum doublets for these patients. The role of radiation in these early stage is definitely controversial, and most centers just give chemotherapy and reserve radiation for particular scenarios where there's margin positive or N2 disease that has been detected, or N2 and N3 disease that has been detected. Next is treatment. So early stage tumors, the management, I have not spoken about radiation, but that is also a viable option if the patient is not fit for surgery. Radical RT and SBRT for these patients can be a curative option for early stage tumors. Coming to the management of locally advanced stage, there's a lot of controversy surrounding management of stage 3 disease. So I try and delve a little deeper into this. So basically stage 3 disease, the way to think about this is to try and divide them into potentially resectable, that is borderline resectable, what you would call, or unresectable. So potentially resectable is mostly single station N2 disease. And unresectable disease is usually multi-station bulky N2 disease, bulky N3 disease, and T4 disease, of course. Mostly the question regarding resectability and unresectability largely comes down to nodal burden rather than the primary tumor, because most cases, unless it is invading the mediastinal vascular structures or something, most cases, even with a chest wall resection or a diaphragmatic resection, you can do a proper resection for a T4, a T3, T4 lesion as well. But nodal burden is a different case scenario, because in most of these cases, if it is beyond multi-station and bulky N2, it is considered as unresectable. And the way you try and treat them and deal with them are quite different. So it is a heterogeneous disease, as I said. Locally advanced primary tumors like T3, T4 with a low nodal burden, you can still try and do an upfront surgery or try and downstage them with neoadjuvant chemotherapy and do. And the other kind of tumors are N2 positive and N3 positive non-small cell, which I will delve in a little deeper. So again, in N2 disease, if surgery is feasible, you would definitely want to downstage them rather than go ahead for upfront surgery. That was the whole premise of trying and doing the aggressive mediastinal sampling and staging in these patients. So you would try and do a neoadjuvant therapy, mostly chemotherapy, preferred over radiation, followed by surgery, versus chemotherapy, chemoradiation alone. So there is definitely some sort of DFS benefit by doing downstaging and surgery as opposed to definitive CTRT in N2 disease. So management of N2 disease, why this topic is dealt with separately is because of the controversies that are there in the management of these diseases. Most of the times, even though it is potentially curable, the prognosis is quite poor, ranging to around 15 to 30%, with a high degree of heterogeneity in the groups that are there in stage 3. So as I said, the divisions are going to be between resectable and non-resectable. That is going to be probably resectable, and the extent of N2 disease, whether it is single station or multi-station bulky disease, or it's N3 disease. So what would you do if there is an N2 disease? One thing is you would do an aggressive mediastinal staging and detect an N2 or an N3 disease before surgery. In such case, if the patient is going to be potentially resectable, you try and downstage these patients with neoadjuvant chemotherapy and proceed with surgery. That would be the best line of therapy. If you determine that this is not a single station N2, it is a bulky multi-station N2 or an N3 disease, you would try and refer this patient for a definitive chemo-RT. The following slides are just illustrating few evidences regarding what I have just said. So, and the third option would be you would think that this is an N1 disease and try and do upfront surgery, and then you have detected N2 at surgery. What would you do next? So what you would do is you would give adjuvant chemotherapy in this, because it is node positive. Even for N1, you would give adjuvant chemotherapy, and that is a standard of care. Giving post-operative RT is again a debate, because there is a meta-analysis where the role of giving RT in this detected N2 has not been clear. However, a recent randomized control trial has shown that there is definitely some DFS benefit, though there is no overall benefit. Most centers try and tend towards giving some sort of RT along with chemotherapy if this is multi-station N2 that is detected during surgery, even though that's not the standard. So that is N2 detected during surgery. You can give adjuvant chemotherapy. Adjuvant RT is left to the institutional protocol. So the other scenario where before surgery, you have done a CT scan and you have seen that there are non-resectable bulky nodes, that is multi-station N2 or N3 disease. The standard of care, as I said, usually in these patients is going to be concurrent chemoradiation therapy given as a curative intent. And there's no benefit of surgery in this. The recent development in treating stage 3 disease, which is unresectable, is to give adjuvant durvalumab after you give chemoradiation therapy. That is by the PACIFIC 2 trial, and the results are out, and that has become a standard of care now. So this is the third scenario, resectable N2 disease, single station. So surgery is the modality of treatment, but you would try and do it after an induction chemotherapy. All three options are viable options. There are centers which would do all three in different settings. But the one with the maximum evidence is one in between, where you go give induction chemotherapy and followed by surgery. And this is the evidence for that, which is based on a meta-analysis where you give induction chemotherapy followed by surgery. So what's the usual consensus in N2 disease is incidentally detected during surgery. You give adjuvant chemotherapy, post-operative RT is dependent on institutional protocols. If you detect a single station N2 disease before surgery, on mediastinal examination, you do NACT followed by surgery. And if there is unresectable multi-station bulky lymph nodes, you give concurrent chemo-RT followed by durvalumab, which is immunotherapy. Yeah, this is just a repetition of what I said. Some evidence for adjuvant chemotherapy, where the LACE pooled analysis basically showed an improvement in overall survival by giving adjuvant chemotherapy, and that's why the rule is usually followed for the T tumors more than 4 centimeters, and any lymph node positive should be considered for adjuvant chemotherapy. Adjuvant RT, as I said, most centers give it for positive margins or incomplete resection or an N2 or an N3 disease found intraoperatively. Metastatic, I'm not going to cover, but this is the basic way in which it's decided. So in metastatic settings, the histology also matters in trying and determining what therapy you give, whether it is squamous small cell or a non-squamous small cell. In a non-squamous, that is adenocarcinoma, you would try and look for targetable mutations. If there are targetable mutations, then you go and give oral TKI. If there are no targetable mutations, you do a PDL1 testing, and based on that you proceed. Squamous, usually no targetable mutations or testing is done as a routine. So you can start them with chemotherapy upfront or do a PDL1 testing, and based on that start them on immunotherapy. So just a brief summary of what was covered. We spoke about how you determine the risk of a lung mass. A mass is defined as anything more than 3 centimeters, and usually with suspicious features, you straight away go and do biopsy. A nodule is something which is less than 3 centimeters, and you have to follow these guidelines where you do a risk assessment and try and see what to do next. It could be a biopsy or a follow-up for these. So once you determine a lung with a histopathology that it is a lung malignancy, you do a staging workup with a CT scan or a PET CT if it is available, and an MRI brain. Then you do an invasive mediastinal staging as per the ESTS guidelines. So with that, you get the complete T stage and the nodal stage of this patient. Then you try and determine if it is early stage or locally advanced. If it is early stage, surgery is the primary modality if the patient is fit, versus SBRT if the patient is unfit. You do a lymph node dissection, and after surgery, if the patient is a candidate for adjuvant chemotherapy, you go ahead with that. Locally advanced is a heterogeneous disease. Even though it is stage 3, there are different ways in which it can present. Single station N2 disease is usually potentially resectable, but even though you can resect it, you don't do an upfront surgery. You try and downstage them with chemotherapy and do surgery. The scenario with bulky multi-station N2 or N3 disease is different, where the treatment is going to be definitive CTRT followed by durvalumab. Yeah, that was the gist. Thank you.
Very elaborate class, but nicely covered.
Yeah.
Varun, only one thing. So you mentioned about left side lymphatic drainage and difficulty in accessing the mediastinum. But did you mention what are the techniques we use for mediastinum staging?
I didn't mention all the techniques. I've mentioned only. I'll cover this. I have a slide on it. I'll just
mention it for benefit of.
At Tata, do you used to do all mediastinoscopies for all these cases?
All cases. Yeah.
Where is this? 1 second.
Sir, Kidwai Naga, sir, Sandeep sir?
No.
Outside Tata, I don't think not many centers are doing mediastinoscopy. Only very few centers.
Even we were not doing. None Manipal daga one case nodidde ashte. Arbitrarily nodilla.
So the techniques for mediastinoscopy. So the basic thing is, first, if an EBUS is feasible, that is the best way to go ahead, because if it is there in our institute, so endobronchial ultrasound, they can target the nodes, and if there are no nodes on CT also, there are guidelines where you can try and target the 2R, 2L, 4R, 4L, and the subcarinal. Those nodes can be easily targetable by endobronchial ultrasound as well. So if anything is positive on that, then that you stop there, and then it is positive node. But then if it is not positive and your risk of positivity is still high, you do a mediastinal staging. In that, there is a cervical mediastinoscopy where essentially what you do, it is a surgical procedure. You intubate the patient, you take them to OT. So you make a space in the supraclavicular region. Essentially, the tract that you're going in is just anterior to the trachea, and you use a video guidance. So it is like, just like you do a laparoscopy or an arthroscopy. So this is a video mediastinoscopy, and the surgeon looks at the screen and then tries and operates. So as you go on the plane superior, just above the trachea, so what you encounter first is going to be the station 2 lymph nodes. On the right, it's called 2R. On the left, it's called 2L. You sample those, then you go in deeper and sample the 4R and 4L, and then the subcarinal as well. So most centers which are doing this routinely, what they do is they send this for frozen section, keep the patient intubated. So if at all this frozen section comes positive, they abandon the procedure and send the patient for neoadjuvant therapy. If the frozen comes negative, they go ahead with lobar resection. That is one technique. Anything else, Bharat? And as I said, a cervical mediastinoscopy, you cannot sample all the mediastinal nodes or whatever it is mentioned in this diagram. So definitely, as you can see, whatever is around the trachea, the 2R, 2L and 4R, 4L and subcarinal, you can. What about these nodes which are in the AP window, 6 and 5? Those are usually not sampled routinely. But if those are the ones that are going to be enlarged in the PET CT or the CT scan, you can do other techniques where you can do a VATS sampling, or you
VATS and do the sampling.
yeah, you can do a VATS and do the sampling. So
Thoracoscopy, not VATS.
so,
VATS, when you say you put an
okay,
incision,
sorry.
it's a thoracoscopy. Okay.
Thoracoscopy, yeah. So depending on that. So if there are nodes that are seen on the CT scan, you would definitely target it based on that. Most commonly, it would be paratracheal lymph node or subcarinal. If there are additional nodes like AP window nodes, whatever is required, you do for that. Like for example, thoracoscopic sampling. If there are no nodes seen on the CT scan and you still want to do a blind procedure, then the only thing most centers do is try and do a station 2, station 4 and station 7 sampling. Anything?
Going by this, for today's case, ideally, what we discussed in the tumor board, so it was mediastinal node was negative based on the EBUS FNA. So ideally, we should have planned mediastinoscopy and biopsy for them. But anyway, since we don't have it available, so and based on the size of the tumor, we have gone in for a neoadjuvant chemotherapy.
But this, yeah, this tumor, because the risk of actually having nodal metastasis is quite high.
Yeah.
Central tumor.
Going by the size.
Yeah, central tumor quite high. Ideally, we should have proceeded, but anyway, at the end of it, we are still giving neoadjuvant. So.
Yeah, there are other indications for neoadjuvant.
Hello, good evening, Dr. Varun.
Yeah.
Sir, today's case was T3, no, sir? So.
Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Varun. Hello.
Yeah, Adil, we can hear.
Yeah, this Dr. Yeah, hi. Yeah. So just from patient's perspective, I have no idea regarding the EBUS. How long will the procedure take? And like it's a daycare procedure, what is the anesthesia required for it? The EBUS procedure, and what is the cost of it?
Basically, bronchoscopy guided.
Okay. And
so you do a bronchoscopy, and with the bronchoscopy, there is an ultrasound which is there. So basically, side viewing ultrasound is there in the bronchoscopy. So with that, you guide your needle and do an FNAC from the lymph nodes.
Right, sir. Means approximately what is the duration of the procedure, sir? And
how
much will it cost? And the expense, sir?
Expense, I'm not sure. Maybe roughly around 20,000 in Fortis, I think.
Okay. And second thing,
really sure.
is the mediastinal evaluation different for different like histology? Like, is it the same for small cell lung cancer and non-small cell lung cancer?
There is no mediastinal
small cell are more
evaluation for small cell. This is only for non-small cell.
Okay.
Small cell is a totally different topic. So this is only for non-small cell I have discussed. So does not change with the histology of adeno and squamous. For non-small cell, this is the one. But small cell, there is no mediastinal evaluation that you would do.
See, small cell, nowhere it comes in operable state. So it is like it's an accident if it really happens.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Nothing.
Just tell me, Dr.
That-
Shrikant.
No, nothing. I just heard you talking. That's why I asked.
No, that
So-
under today's case they were discussing, no, I mean neoadjuvant anta. So anyway, it was T3 tumor. So straight away when it is T3, hello.
Yeah,
Yeah,
ma'am.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we'll.
Yeah. Since it was T3 tumor and the planes were not very well defined. So anyhow, I mean, once the decision of neoadjuvant was taken, probably even EBUS or mediostenoscopy could be postponed. That is what I was thinking. I mean, that is what even the guidelines says, no?
I didn't get your question.
No, today's case, they were discussing that. I mean, it should have been ideally proceeded, even though EBUS came negative, then it should have been proceeded with mediostenoscopy. That is what you discussed, right?
Yeah.
So it is a T3 tumor. So, and since it is borderline resectable lesion or imaging wise,
Correct.
so is it not prudent to consider mediostenoscopy post neoadjuvant rather than upfront?
There is no need of mediostenoscopy post neoadjuvant, madam.
That is no need.
No need for
There is
once
no
you-
need.
Anyway,
I
we'll
think
have complete clearance.
we'll be addressing the mediastinal lymph nodes in any case. Mediastinoscopy is something, it's a staging procedure.
Yeah,
And
the-
anyway, on the imaging wise, even though there are some nodes on the N2, they are not bulky, unresectable nodes. So that is what, there is a small risk that we might be missing a macroscopic N2 disease. Is that risk we'll have to take in this patient.
But it's okay with the T3, with the other T characteristics, we decided to give
Correct,
neoadjuvant, right? So
Correct,
anyway, it
correct.
is okay. So even if the node was positive, our line of management is correct.
Sir, just a thought process. So since we don't have a mediastinoscopy, hello, Sandeep sir.
Yeah, I can hear. Tell me.
So next case, I mean, if we have a similar kind of a scenario, and if the tumor is not T3 and we are going for a surgery, probably what we could do is when we are doing VATS, we initially do the mediastinal nodes, send them for frozen, especially if EBUS is negative, and then we have gone for the surgery. And anyway, so we would have done the nodes and we would have sent for frozen. So based on the nodal report, then we could proceed with the surgery is what I was thinking, because we don't have a mediastinoscope.
But see, up to N2, we have to do surgery anyway because we are giving neoadjuvant, no? Upfront surgery, we are not.
Not in this scenario, not in this case. I'm just saying that supposing this was a 5 centimeter tumor without that pleural involvement and similar kind of nodes on imaging, and we did EBUS FNA, which was negative. So then we would have taken them for surgery, correct?
Correct. Okay.
So when we go for the surgery, we should ideally do a mediastinal lymph nodal staging first, send them for frozen, and then go for the resection of the primary.
Makes sense.
Yeah, that is what I was trying to convey.
Okay. But only problem is when you go again for surgery, no, for lobectomy, there will be too much adhesion. The lung would be stuck to the mediastinum because you would have done lymph node dissection. So then that will cause a problem for us.
We'll have to check some literature on that. So probably someone.
Yeah.
Mediastinoscopy is actually, even though it is there in guidelines, even when I was looking into some case discussions online and all, so even good institutions, they are not, sometimes they just don't do it as an institutional protocol. And then
many institutions don't do mediastinoscopy. In fact, Tata is one of the very few actually who aggressively do. I have also seen mainly in Tata when those days also when I had gone there. I remember seeing mediastinoscopy only there.
Yeah, only there. And in this slide that I have shown, where it is in this middle category where it is EBUS or VAM, The reason why it is EBUS or WAM is because it says depending on your institute, your negative or positive predictive value you should be knowing. So if your bronchoscopist is quite good and the yield that they get is quite good, so EBUS is the way to go. So it is not EBUS followed by WAM in this category, the middle one where I have said, where you have a risk of N2 nodes, but still there is no N2 node seen.
Yeah.
Either you do an EBUS.
It's only when there is a highly suspicious lymph node which comes negative on on EBUS, that's when you have to do it. Otherwise, no.
Correct.
That is the flow chart. That's correct. That's it.
Yeah. Any other doubts?
No, Varun, one more thing about MRI brain. So guideline says for all stages, right? MRI brain in addition to the PET scan.
Actually, very early stage you can avoid is what they say. But
you can avoid. Yeah, that is the point I wanted to make.
You can avoid.
Stage 1 and stage 2 not required, sir. That is what it says. Stage 3 onwards, MRI is must, even though with PET CT.
Yeah, correct.
If PET CT does not show lesions, then MRI needs to be done. But if there are more than 3 lesions on PET CT itself, then again MRI does not make a sense.
Yeah.
Even PET CT.
And for all small cells.
Sir?
All small cell cancers require MRI brain. All, whatever stage you think clinically it is.
Correct.
MRI brain is required, but for non-small cell, it is only for higher stages. Yeah.
Stage 3 and stage 4.
Yeah.
Yes.
So one last question. Suppose if we give any CT 3 cycles and after that still it is inoperable, then after that giving CTRT, any CT followed by CTRT, is there any evidence versus CTRT alone?
Yeah, there is evidence, Adil. I mean, you can do like that. Even in the very large tumor, even in the very large tumors, wherein we are not able to give CTRT definitively, include all the fields. In such cases, we can anyway go for the NACT followed by CTRT, right? Even in a definitive. So, I mean, that is definitely, there are papers on that.
Okay.
I have a question for you, Adil. This durvalumab, now that it has got, it has established role in locally advanced lung cancer, is it cost effective? I mean, is it there in India and has it started?
Durvalumab is definitely there in India, madam.
Yeah, it's there. I'm using it for one of my patients.
Okay.
Good question, actually. All immunotherapies, except in a couple of conditions, I think you still need to, you can debate on that actually.
Yeah, but
so definitely there is survival advantage, and that is it's approved and we are using it.
Huge, yeah. Right.
Anything else?
So how come the Zoom didn't get cut? I'm not sure.
You got upgraded.
I got a message saying you can continue the meeting.
Yeah, right.
Anyways, we'll see.
We'll try got confused with the number of lymph node stations in CA lung, and I'll just let you go on.
This happened last
time. So last time also it happened.
Yeah, last time.
In my presentation also this happened. Yeah.
No, we just have to check whenever maybe one person when they is included here, that person the Zoom likes, so that may be the reason. See who was not there in the afternoon.
No, I think Srikanth is hosting it for all the sessions.
Misusing
it. Maybe it has got something to do with it.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, if you host less, maybe it might be. I thought like if I host, maybe we can do recording and start a channel and all those things. Anyways, so any other questions today?
Done, I think.
Good. It was good presentation. Probably we need to repeat this once again to really, I
recorded this session, so all these discussions and all. If anybody interested, we can go through back.
Can you just post that back? I mean, Srikanth, in the group.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And The next class will be in radiation therapy in lung cancer, and after that, Adil will present about medical oncology in lung cancer. Okay.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Okay then. Thank you everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.